In this episode of the podcast, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes here to talk about software. This is chapter 4 is applications and system software. What I'll tell you is the book makes these big, unnecessary, in my opinion, unnecessary distinctions between different kinds of software. What I'll tell you is, sure, there's a little bit of a difference between application and system software. An application in popular conversational use, an application is anything you can install and use, right? Is there any real distinction between an app and an application? No. It used to be that there was this kind of like looking down the nose at app versus application. So an application was a stand-up application like Office or something like that. And an app was just some little piece of software that you would install on your phones, and it was supposed to be quaint. That's BS now. Like, the difference between desktop software and mobile application software is negligible at this point. You can find like AutoCAD, right? So in engineering software that is world-class desktop software for designing everything engineering, right? So whether or not that is, designing a sprocket for use in a large piece of manufacturing equipment to designing the way it is, like the third floor of a building will not collapse into the second floor of a building after, a couple of months of use. That you used to have to do on a desktop. But AutoCAD software on a mobile device is nearly as powerful now as the desktop application is for that. The distinction between app and application, I argue, is so infinitesimally small now that it's really not even worth looking at. As a matter of fact, most of the highest grossing applications are actually apps, things that you find on, the App Store on iOS or Google Play Store on the Android side of things. For the most part, you don't get to choose what your system software is. The operating system software comes with your device, and for the most part, most people will never change that. If you have a Mac, the operating system you're going to use is Mac OS. If you have a Windows PC or a laptop, the operating system you are probably going to use is Windows. If you have an Android phone, that's going to be Android OS. If you have an Apple device, that's going to be iOS. Full stop. There's really no need to investigate that any further. Is it possible to put different operating systems on there? Yes. Is it likely that you're going to put a different operating system on there? No. We have numbers on this. Fewer than 1% of any device ever gets an alternative operating system put on it. So is it really worth talking about? Not in depth. There's a couple of distinctions here in the chapter that I do want to talk about just really quickly, and that's right here on page 128. It's how is software distributed? That really is one of the big new changes that we're going to see. We are probably, for the most of us in this course, we are familiar with locally installed software. So that means whatever device you're on, desktop, laptop, tablet, smartphone, you are going to have something, a piece of software that is installed specifically to that device. So right now I'm recording this on an iPad, and the textbook is available to me on a platform called Bookshelf. So that's the app that I'm using. It's called Vital Source Bookshelf. I'm recording it with a piece of system software, the iOS screen recorder. That's all locally installed. It's only here on this particular iPad, and that is all. Next is, if we just look over here, it's on 129, is a subscription software service. If you use Adobe Creative Suite, you are paying for a subscription, right? Part of what you have is locally installed, but most of everything you use is, via the web. Office 365, you really don't install anything. You use all of that via the web, and you pay a monthly subscription service for that. I actually use a bunch of subscription services on my devices. most of them, I think, most of the subscription services I really probably use on my, tablet and smartphone type devices. I use a service called Bear, Bear, to maintain all of my notes across devices. I use a subscription service for like newspaper access, things like that. Most of us are going to, at some point in time, move to subscription services, at least in part. Software as a service is kind of the next best extension of that. It's where you run a program when you're connected to the internet only. So most of the applications we have are really not software as a service anymore. If you think about like Office 365, it mostly matches up to software as a service, but not entirely. So it's one of the kinds of software you're going to come into contact with, but as an individual, you are probably going to stick mostly with number one, local installation, and number two, subscription-based services. That's the biggest part I really wanted to highlight here. The other thing I'll mention is in a link immediately underneath this video here, I will include the Lifehacker software packages. I use Lifehacker a lot because it's, how can I put this? They are concerned with cost, and I am concerned with cost as well. I am cheap at my very core now. Having worked in education, having worked in philanthropy as long as I have, I work with clients who are like, that's great. How much is that going to cost us? Because if it's greater than zero, I can't afford it. I understand. That's really important to a lot of companies is, cost over everything else is our core concern. What I will include here are links to Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android software packages where you can see that there are either free or low-cost alternatives to the software that's baked in to your operating systems. And some of these are tremendously, tremendously useful. Actually, we've got a couple of them here. Application software at the very top of this page. In the open source application software boxes, I suppose, GIMP is essentially a feature-for-feature copy of Adobe Photoshop. Now, I know I have to squint at feature-for-feature copy to make that technically correct, but for like 85% of people who would ever say, I wanted to use Photoshop, GIMP is probably okay. LibreOffice is essentially a feature-for-feature copy of the Office suite, so Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. Now, is that entirely true? No, it's not quite as user-friendly, but is it free? Yeah, which really gets you a long, long way there. So there's a bunch of software packages that are going to be highlighted there in that Lifehacker application packages that you may find that you have either no use for or some tremendous use for. But the good news is most of them are free. And free means that there's not a whole lot of reason not to give some of these software packages a try.